My name is Rachel Morgan, and at 33 years old, the cool weight of the keys pressed against my palm felt both strange and comforting. I stood just inside the doorway of my new craftsman bungalow in Denver, the faint scent of fresh paint still lingering in the air, mixing with the crisp autumn breeze that drifted through the slightly open windows. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the wide panes at the front, spilling across the honey-colored hardwood floors and painting them with golden streaks. I let the door swing shut behind me, the sound echoing through the empty rooms, and slowly walked forward. My fingertips brushed along the polished wood of the staircase railing, every touch reminding me that this place was mine. Each step I took across the floor felt like proof of that fact, my name on the deed, my money in the bank, and my choice to finally plant roots here. 10 years ago, I would have picked up the phone and called my mom to share this kind of news. She would have told me to take pictures, to describe every detail, and I would have heard pride in her voice. But that was before things changed. 10 years ago was before the invitations stopped arriving, before phone calls went unanswered, before family holidays turned into carefully staged gatherings where I was no longer included. That history lingered here, invisible but heavy, like a faint draft sneaking through a warm room. Buying this house wasn't about square footage or curb appeal. No, it was a statement, a line in the sand. I had built this without them, in the emptiness they left behind when they decided my presence didn't matter. I walked into the kitchen and set the keys down on the granite countertop. The silence wrapped itself around me, but it wasn't the kind of silence that felt lonely. This one felt chosen, deliberate. I pictured the weeks ahead arranging furniture, filling cabinets, planting basil and rosemary in the little patch of soil out back. This was the kind of beginning I had carved out for myself, without permission, without approval. What I didn't expect, what I couldn't have prepared for, was just how quickly they would find a way to step into it again. There was a time when I was the one who made family gatherings happen. Thanksgiving dinners, Christmas decorations, even silly 4th of July games in the backyard. I loved weaving everyone's preferences into something that looked effortless. I'd call weeks ahead, make lists, plan menus, and make sure everyone's favorite dish had a place on the table. Back then, I believed we were a unit, unshakable. The change was so gradual I didn't notice at first. One Thanksgiving, my mum Marianne told me they were keeping it simple that year, just a small dinner with a few people. The next Christmas, my calls about the meal went unanswered until the day after. Then every holiday after that came with vague responses. We're not sure of the plans yet, or it might just be small this time. And then, eventually, there were no calls at all. Marianne had always cared most about appearances. Her version of family was something polished and presentable, something you could show off to neighbors and friends. I suspect I stopped fitting that image. My father, Henry, hated conflict so much he pretended my absence was just some kind of scheduling fluke. Even after years had gone by, my older brother Victor had a competitive streak that made even the smallest success into a contest he had to win. And my younger sister, Caroline, acted like she was naturally entitled to more attention, more space, more of everything. I kept trying anyway. I sent texts, left voicemails, asked directly if I could stop by. At first they responded with polite surprise when I showed up uninvited, the kind of brittle welcome you give to a stranger who overstays their visit. Over time, even that stopped. By the 5th year, I realized I was the only one keeping a finger on the fragile thread that connected us. By the 9th year, I couldn't even tell if that thread still existed. And then came the day that proved it hadn't for a very long time. It was the second Sunday in May Mother's Day. I had convinced myself it would be different that year. I called Marianne 3 days before, told her I wanted to bring flowers and spend the afternoon with her. Her voice was polite but flat. "Oh well, okay. Yes, come by." I ignored the hesitation, wanting so badly to believe my gesture would matter. I chose lilies, her favorite, the kind that opened slowly over days. They cost more than I should have spent, but I told myself it was worth it. I wore a soft green dress she'd once complimented, the one she said made my eyes brighter, as if that small detail could tip the day in my favor. The 40-minute drive to their house was filled with rehearsed greetings and hopeful scripts of what I'd say when she opened the door. But when I pulled into the driveway, the curtains were drawn and the porch sat empty. I rang the bell, waited, rang again. The lilies shook in my grip as the spring breeze carried the smell of fresh-cut grass. I called her phone, straight to voicemail. I tried Henry's phone, then Victor's, then Caroline's. Nothing. I stood there for 15 long minutes before the truth settled in my chest like wet cement. The drive home felt longer. I placed the lilies in a vase on my kitchen table, their beauty mocking me in the silence. That night, I scrolled through my phone, desperate for proof of anything but rejection. It didn't take long. There they were, Marianne, Henry, Victor, and Caroline sitting in a fancy downtown restaurant, all dressed in pastel spring outfits. The caption read, "Mother's Day brunch with the best family ever." A corsage of roses sat on Marianne's wrist, not lilies. I stared at the photo until my eyes blurred. Below the flood of heart emojis and compliments, I spotted my Aunt Deborah's comment, "Not everyone at the table, I see." Just vague enough to pass as casual, but sharp enough to show she knew exactly who was missing. I didn't reply. I just locked my phone, turned off the light, and sat in the dark, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, wondering when exactly my seat at the table had been cleared away for good. It wasn't the last time they excluded me, but that was the day I stopped pretending not to notice. By the time December rolled around that year, I had trained myself to expect nothing. No calls, no texts, no vague invitations that never turned into anything. Still, habits die hard, and one night after work, I found myself scrolling through social media before bed. That's when Caroline's post stopped me cold. It was a picture-perfect Christmas scene. Marianne and Henry sat on the couch by the fireplace, smiling warmly for the camera. Victor's 2 kids were in front of them, wearing matching red and black plaid pajamas, their cheeks pink from excitement, and Caroline front and center, of course, held up a delicate gold bracelet toward the camera, her grin practically glowing dot. The caption read, "Best Christmas ever with the fam. So grateful for these people." I stared at those words until the screen dimmed in my hand. They had celebrated without me. Again, not just celebrated. They called it the best Christmas ever. And still, a tiny piece of me had been holding on to the idea that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. I wasn't angry anymore. That fire had burned out years earlier. What had taken its place was something quieter, heavier clarity, a truth I could no longer escape. I closed the app and opened my contacts list. My thumb hovered for a moment before I tapped Alison Grant's name. She was an old friend from college, now a realtor. We hadn't spoken in months, but when she picked up, I could hear the warmth in her voice, like no time had passed. "Alison, remember how you always told me to call when I was ready to buy a house?" There was a pause, then a bright laugh. "You're ready?" "I'm beyond ready," I said. We talked numbers, neighborhoods, timelines. For years I had missed vacations, skipped joint family gifts, avoided let's all pitch in expenses. Without realizing it, their rejection had built up my freedom fund. Every holiday they left me out had turned into another quiet deposit toward independence. When we hung up, I sat back on my couch. The quiet around me felt different. That night, not the emptiness of being left out, but the stillness of standing at the threshold of something entirely my own. The next morning, I woke up with a list in my head and a steadiness in my chest I hadn't felt in years. I was done waiting for an invitation. It was time to open my own door. House hunting turned out to be less intimidating than I expected. Alison moved fast, lining up showings in neighborhoods that matched my budget and my craving for quiet, with no big vacations, no endless family contributions, and no gifts split for ways. My savings had grown stronger than I'd realized. The irony wasn't lost on me. Every birthday and holiday I'd been excluded from had quietly built the foundation of my escape. We toured a few places. Some had charm but no soul. Others had potential buried under decades of neglect. I walked through living rooms that felt cramped, kitchens that smelled like mildew, bedrooms that seemed too dark, too heavy. Each time, Alison gave me space to decide for myself. Then came one grey Saturday morning. Alison unlocked the door to a small craftsman bungalow on a tree-lined street in Denver's Washington Park neighborhood. And the moment I stepped inside, I knew. Sunlight streamed through wide front windows, warming the floors in streaks of honey gold. The living room flowed into a kitchen with gleaming counters and just enough space for me to cook without bumping into myself. Upstairs, 2 bedrooms, one for sleeping, one for an office. Out back, a little patio wrapped in climbing roses and a yard just big enough for a small herb garden. "This is it," I said before we'd even finished the tour. I put in an offer that afternoon. It was accepted the next day. Within weeks, the paperwork was signed, the keys were mine, and I stood in that same kitchen with boxes stacked against the walls. That first night, I didn't unpack much. I set up a single armchair by the window, opened a bottle of wine, and poured myself a glass. The silence felt different here. Clean, light. Mine. I raised the glass toward the empty room and said it out loud, just to hear the truth of it. Here's to never needing their approval again. The words settled over me like a seal, closing off years of disappointment and replacing them with something much more valuable. And that was when I decided the very first thing I would do here was throw a party, once the boxes were unpacked and the furniture was in place. I started a new kind of list, not of chores, not of repairs, but of names. People who had shown up for me in big ways and small. Friends from college who still called just to check in. Colleagues who cheered me on when I succeeded. Neighbors I had already exchanged warm hellos with on the sidewalk. At the very top of the list was Aunt Deborah, followed by cousins who had never once made me feel like an afterthought. It felt good to create a guest list without obligation. No shoulds, no unspoken rules about who had to be included. Just the people I truly wanted to see. On the afternoon of the party, the house came alive. Voices, music, footsteps on the porch. The front door swung open and shut in a steady rhythm as people arrived, carrying bottles of wine, casseroles, desserts, and hugs that felt like home in the kitchen. Laughter bubbled up so loud someone had to lean against the counter just to catch their breath. The patio lights glowed against the dusk, outlining clusters of people deep in conversation. Everywhere I looked, there was warmth, ease, connection. It was everything my family gatherings had never been. Genuine, comfortable, without the constant undercurrent of comparison or performance. Aunt Deborah found me near the snack table, refilling a bowl of chips. She smiled, her eyes sweeping across the crowded room. "Honey, this is a beautiful party," she said. Then her voice softened. "But where's your mum and the rest of them?" I met her gaze without hesitation. "I didn't invite them." Her brows lifted. "Oh, did something happen?" "Yes," I said, my tone steady. "For the last 10 years, they haven't invited me to a single holiday or birthday. So I decided not to invite them either." Her expression shifted, first surprise, then something closer to resolve. "I had no idea," she murmured. "I knew she'd tell the others." Deborah was the quiet connector, the one who carried news along family lines. But this time, I wasn't afraid of the story she would tell. Let them hear it. Let them sit with it. The party stretched late into the evening. Laughter spilled into every corner of my new home. When the last guest left, I stood in the quiet again, but this time it didn't feel empty. It felt full, like the walls themselves had absorbed the joy. For the first time in years, I felt lighter. 3 days later, the storm arrived on my doorstep. The knock was sharp and insistent. More demand than request. Through the sidelight window, I saw the Marianne, Henry, Victor, and Caroline clustered together like an advancing unit. I opened the door only far enough to speak. "What do you need?" Without answering, Marianne brushed past me, Henry trailing close behind. Victor and Caroline followed, their eyes already scanning the place as though my home were a crime scene they'd been called to investigate. "Nice kitchen," Victor muttered, running his hand along the counter. It didn't sound like a compliment. It sounded like an audit. Caroline wandered into the living room, picking up a small ceramic vase, turning it over, and setting it back down with a faint smirk. "Looks comfortable," she said, her tone sharp with implication. And then the pause came. Marianne positioned herself in the center of the room, her hands clasped like a judge about to deliver a ruling. "How could you do this to us, Rachel? Do you have any idea what you've done?" Her voice dripped with outrage. "Deborah has been calling. Now everyone's asking why we treat you differently. They're acting like we've made you an outsider." I leaned against the doorway, keeping my voice even. "Why haven't you invited me to a family gathering in 10 years? Silence. Henry shifted uncomfortably, staring at the floor. Marianne opened her mouth, then closed it again. "You don't even know where I work, do you?" I asked. The silence deepened. They exchanged glances, but no one answered. "I've been in a senior role at my company for years," I continued. "If you cared, you would know that. But you never asked." Marianne's lips thinned. "Well, you never told us." I stepped toward the door and pulled it wide open. "Time for you to leave. I've already done more for you than you ever did for me. At least, I'm letting you walk out with dignity and like the day you left me standing on a porch with flowers on. Mother's Day." For once, Marianne had no comeback. Her face flushed and her eyes darted to the others. One by one, they filed out, their indignation trailing behind them into the cold evening air. When the door closed, the quiet settled over me again. But this time, it didn't feel chosen. It felt earned. The weeks after that hospital call passed in a blur, though blur doesn't quite describe it. Blurs are soft edges, smoothed out, things blending together. This was different. Each day cut into me like a sharp edge, a jagged reminder of just how deeply I had been left outside the circle of my own family. Caroline recovered quickly. At least that's what the carefully worded updates suggested. I never got them directly, of course. The news reached me in fragments. A relative posting a vague, "so grateful for healing" message. A co-worker of Victor's mentioning casually that his sister was doing much better. An acquaintance sending me a screenshot from Facebook of Caroline smiling in a hospital gown with balloons at her bedside. All of it confirmed the same thing. She had survived. She was on the mend. And I had not been invited to witness any of it. When I first saw the picture of her propped up in that bed, grinning weakly while Victor sat beside her with his hand proudly on her shoulder, I felt two emotions at once. Relief that she was alive, that the accident hadn't stolen her life, and grief, not grief for her body, but for myself, for the space I used to hold in that family and no longer did. I cried that night, but it wasn't the kind of sobbing that shakes you. It was quieter, heavier, like something inside me was folding in on itself. The silence from Marianne and Henry only confirmed what I already knew. I wasn't part of the circle anymore. I was on the outside looking in, peering through windows I could no longer open. It's one thing to be left out of a dinner or a holiday, but to be shut out during a crisis that told me all I needed to know. For a while, I went through my days like someone living a double life. On the surface, everything appeared normal. I went to work, brewed coffee in the mornings, watered the plants on my porch, and even waved at my neighbors as though nothing had changed. But inside, I was unraveling. Every ordinary task felt strange. as though my body was going through motions while my mind stayed fixed on a single truth. My family no longer wanted me. I started writing in a journal again, something I hadn't done in years. At first, the entries were raw, pages full of anger and sharp words I could never say out loud. I wrote about the photo from Mother's Day, the silence after the hospital, the way Victor's face seemed smug in every picture, as though he'd won something. But as the days turned into weeks, the tone shifted. My words softened into questions. Why me? When did I stop being enough? Why was I easier to cut out than to keep? Those questions didn't have answers, but writing them down helped. It gave me a place to set the weight I carried, so it wouldn't crush me completely. Some nights I would close the journal and place my hand on the cover, as though it were a living thing keeping my secret safe. One Sunday afternoon, about a month after Caroline's release, I made the mistake of driving past my parents' house. I hadn't planned to. It was muscle memory, the way the car seemed to know the turns on its own. When I pulled onto their street, my chest tightened. Cars lined the driveway. Through the open curtains, I saw people gathered in the living room. Laughter floated out faintly when someone opened the door. I slowed down, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter, and in that one glance, I knew exactly what it was. They were having a welcome home party for Caroline, my sister, freshly healed, surrounded by balloons, streamers, and smiling faces, and me, not even thought of, not even invited. I drove away before anyone could see me. My vision blurred, this time not from metaphor, but from tears that refused to stay put. By the time I reached my bungalow, I felt both numb and raw, as though my body couldn't decide which state to commit to. I sat on my front steps until the sky darkened, my arms wrapped around my knees, whispering to myself the truth I'd been resisting for years. They don't want you. They will never want you. It sounds harsh when I say it out loud now, but in that moment it was liberating. Painful, yes, but freeing in the same way ripping off a bandage frees you from the ache of clinging to false hope. That night, I opened my journal again. This time I didn't write about them. I wrote about me, about the small ways I'd managed to survive their absence, about the friends who had shown up for me without hesitation, about the new house, with its creaky floors and bright windows, waiting to be filled with life. I wrote about the basil sprouting in the garden bed out back, stubborn and green. I wrote until my hand cramped and my eyes grew heavy. And when I finally closed the journal, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: resolve. I realized then that I had a choice. I could keep circling the perimeter of their world, begging for scraps of attention, or I could step fully into mine. The life I had built wasn't small. It wasn't less. It was simply mine. The next morning, I began making changes. Small ones, at first. I unfollowed Victor and Caroline on social media. Their curated smiles and inside jokes no longer had the right to invade my peace. I deleted Marianne's number from my phone, not because I didn't remember it, but because I didn't want it staring back at me every time I scrolled through contacts I actually used. I kept Henry's though. A part of me wasn't ready to sever every tie. Then came the bigger steps. I joined a book club at the local library, something I'd thought about for years but never done. I invited neighbors over for coffee on a Saturday morning, and to my surprise, they came. I even signed up for a pottery class. My hands clumsy at first, but gradually steadier, as I shaped lumps of clay into bowls that held more pride than perfection. Each new step stitched me back, together in ways I didn't expect. Where there had once been silence, there was now laughter echoing in my living room. Where there had once been absence, there was now presence, my presence. Chosen and deliberate. Still, the old wounds didn't vanish overnight. There were nights when the loneliness crept in, when I lay awake wondering if Marianne ever thought of me, if Henry ever missed me, if Caroline or Victor ever glanced at an empty chair and noticed it was mine. But instead of letting those thoughts swallow me, I let them pass like clouds drifting across the sky. They didn't define me anymore. One evening, after a particularly messy attempt at pottery left clay smeared across my cheek, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror. I looked ridiculous, like a child playing in mud, and for the first time in years, I laughed at myself. A deep, unguarded laugh. And in that sound, I heard something I hadn't realized was missing: joy. Not joy handed to me by someone else, not joy borrowed from approval or belonging, but joy that rose up from inside me simply because I existed. That was the turning point. That was when I stopped thinking of myself as the daughter who had been forgotten and started seeing myself as the woman who had survived. The truth is, family doesn't always come from blood. Sometimes it comes from neighbors who accept your clumsy invitations. Sometimes it comes from strangers in a pottery class who cheer when your bowl doesn't collapse. Sometimes it comes from friends who show up with soup when you're sick or sit with you on the porch when you're too tired to talk. And sometimes it comes from within, from the version of yourself that refuses to give up, even when every door you once knocked on stays closed. I had spent years waiting for Marianne to smile at me the way she smiled at Caroline, for Henry to reach out to me the way he reached out to Victor, for my siblings to choose me the way siblings are supposed to. But waiting had only broken me. Choosing myself, finally and fully, that's what began to heal me. Time has a way of softening edges, but it also has a way of making truths impossible to ignore. By the time a full year had passed since Caroline's accident, my life looked nothing like it had before. The house that once echoed with silence now carried traces of me everywhere. A bright yellow teapot sat on the stove, always ready for morning tea. A mismatched collection of bowls from my pottery class filled the kitchen shelves. The garden out back had grown wild, basil spreading into oregano, rosemary reaching for the sky, and me. I was no longer a woman waiting for a phone to ring. The calls didn't come, of course. Not on my birthday, not at Christmas. Not on the quiet Tuesday afternoons when I used to imagine Marianne surprising me with an unexpected check-in. Their silence was complete, like a door not only shut, but locked from the other side. At first, I thought the lack of contact would crush me, that it would feel like suffocating in a room without air. But over time, I realized something else. Silence can also be space. And in that space, I discovered myself. My book club became a second family. The kind of people who debated novels with the same passion other families reserved for sports or politics. The neighbors I'd once only waved to now dropped by with cookies, with tools, with invitations to backyard barbecues. At my pottery class, I wasn't just shaping clay anymore. I was shaping belonging, piece by piece. One evening, after hosting a dinner for a handful of these new friends, I stood in the kitchen rinsing plates, laughter still echoing from the living room. For a moment, I just paused. Water running over my hands, the hum of voices drifting toward me, the smell of garlic and roasted vegetables lingering in the air. And I thought, this is what family feels like. It wasn't the family I was born into, but it was the family I had chosen, and who had chosen me back. Of course, the old ache didn't vanish completely. Grief doesn't work that way. Sometimes it hit me in unexpected places, walking past the card aisle at the grocery store, hearing a song that used to play during family road trips, catching a whiff of my mother's perfume on a stranger. Those moments still made my chest tighten, but instead of breaking me, they reminded me of the distance I had survived. One particular Sunday, I woke to find a letter in my mailbox. The handwriting was unmistakable Henry's. My heart raced as I tore it open, hands shaking like they had when I once stood outside that hospital room. The letter was short, almost painfully so. He wrote that he hoped I was doing well, that he thought of me often, and that he was sorry things had turned out the way they had. He didn't mention Marianne. He didn't mention Victor or Caroline. Just him, just his quiet apology. Scrawled across a single page. I sat with that letter for hours, reading it again and again. It wasn't enough to erase the years of absence. It wasn't enough to undo the rejection. But it was something, a crack in the wall I had once thought impenetrable. I didn't write back right away. I let the paper rest on my nightstand, glancing at it each morning as though it might reveal more with time. When I finally did respond, I kept it simple. I told him I was okay. I told him about the house, about my garden, about how I was finding joy in unexpected places. I didn't ask for more, didn't beg for explanations. I just wrote the truth. I am living. I am okay. Whether he showed that letter to Marianne or tucked it away, I'll never know. The silence continued from the rest of them, but I no longer needed their voices to measure my worth. Looking back now, I see my life in 2 chapters. The first was shaped by the ache of exclusion, by years spent trying to earn a place that had quietly been taken away. The second was shaped by the strength it took to step into my own life, to claim my own space, to build something new from the pieces left behind. And here's what I've learned. Family is not guaranteed. Blood is not a contract. Love is not owed simply because you share a last name. What matters is who shows up, who holds your hand when you're weak, who laughs beside you when you're strong. In my darkest moments, I believed I was abandoned. But in truth, I was redirected. Their absence pushed me toward people who welcomed me without conditions, toward a life I might never have built if I had stayed trapped in their half-hearted embrace. Sometimes I wonder if Marianne ever thinks of me late at night, if Victor or Caroline ever scroll back through old photos and notice I'm missing. Maybe they do. Maybe they don't. Either way, it no longer defines me. The last entry in my journal, written not long ago, sums it up better than anything I could say now. I thought my story was about being left out, but really, it's about finding my way in, into friendships that feel like family, into hobbies that bring joy, into a house that feels like home, into a life that is mine. I am no longer waiting for them to open the door. I have built my own. I close the journal each time with a sense of peace, knowing that the Rachel who once stood outside a locked house with lilies in her hand has grown into someone else entirely, someone stronger, someone whole. So this is my story. Not one of bitterness, though bitterness could have taken root. Not one of endless grief, though grief had its season. This is a story of choosing myself when no one else would, of building a family from the ground up, not with blood, but with love. And if you are listening, if you have ever felt forgotten by the very people who were supposed to remember you most, let me tell you this: you are not alone. You are not less. And you are not unworthy of belonging. Sometimes the family you lose makes space for the family you create. And sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is permission to stop knocking on closed doors and to start walking through the ones you can open with your own 2 hands.